Around 1 a.m. on August the 27th, 2000, a fisherman named Sam Watts was doing his best to maintain his balance on the deck of a large commercial fishing boat he was working on. While trying to do so, he looked over at his colleague Michael Edwards, another fisherman who was clinging to a pole as the boat rocked beneath their feet. Sam, Michael, and 4 other crew members had just dropped anchor 56 miles off the northeastern coast of Queensland, Australia. Up until about an hour ago, the sea had been very calm, but now a massive storm had swept in, with winds and waves rising dramatically. As the other 4 crew members went below deck to try and get some sleep, Sam and Michael remained on deck, working to secure everything before they would go below as well. Sam and Michael decided to split up to work more efficiently, with Sam going to the front of the boat and Michael to the back, each working their way towards the middle of the boat, checking all the ropes and ties to ensure they were secure. Once they reached the center, they planned to be ready to go below deck. As Sam and Michael began their tasks, they kept an eye on each other, as the situation was dangerous. At one point, when Sam bent down to check a particular tie, he lost sight of Michael for just a second. In that moment, a giant wave slammed into the side of the boat, nearly tipping it over. Sam was thrown toward the railing, but, fortunately, managed to grab hold before being thrown into the water. When the boat began to stabilize, Sam looked frantically toward the back of the boat to find Michael. Through the darkness and rain, he saw Michael sliding into the ocean, unable to grab onto anything. When the boat settled again, Sam screamed for Michael, but there was no response. He ran below deck and woke up the entire crew. The crew came up on deck, turned on the large searchlights and started bailing out water through the fierce storm, looking for any signs of Michael. Meanwhile, the captain used the radio to contact the police. After several minutes, a police boat arrived, and the crew continued their desperate search for Michael, but he was nowhere to be found. The police began to circle the area, calling out for Michael and sending out floating buoys in hopes that he might see one and grab it. But there was no sign of him. Michael had completely disappeared. The police continued the search throughout the morning and into the early afternoon, as did the crew on the fishing boat, but there was no trace of Michael. Around noon, the search was called off, and the police informed Sam and the rest of the crew that Michael had likely drowned. Naturally, Sam and the crew were in shock. It had all happened so quickly. How could Michael, who had been joking with them just hours before, now be gone? It was unbelievable. However, now Sam and the crew had to overcome their grief and make a cold, practical decision. Should they continue fishing here or return home because of the loss? You might think that making this decision was easy and they would go home given what had happened. How could they stay and continue fishing after such a tragedy? But you must understand that going on these trips requires a lot of money. They had just set out and hadn't caught anything yet, so they had spent all that money without any return. These fishermen weren't wealthy. In fact, they needed the money from this trip just to support their families. So if they returned now, it would be very painful for them all, and it would also be difficult to get funding for another trip. After some awkward discussion, the crew decided they should stay and continue fishing. The silver lining was that if they stayed for another day or so, Michael's body might surface and they could at least recover him and return him to his family. So throughout the day, the fishermen remained at sea and successfully caught a lot of fish, including a 6-foot, 100-pound tuna. Although this was great for their work, there was no time to celebrate since they had lost their friend the previous day, making it a very sad day. All day, the fishermen watched the water in hopes of seeing Michael's body, but by the end of the 24-hour fishing period there was no sign of him. They packed up and returned to port, sold all the tuna they had caught, and then each fisherman went home to grieve the loss of their friend. A few days later, a worker at a fish processing plant was standing in front of the fish processing line, with a massive 97-pound tuna in front of him. One of the tuna caught by Sam and the other fishermen after their friend fell into the sea. The worker took his knife and began to open the fish as he did every day. When he cut into the large fish and looked inside, he suddenly stopped and couldn't believe what he saw. He then began to scream. It turned out that after being thrown into the sea during the storm, Michael was likely still alive when he hit the water. However, the area they were fishing in off the coast of Queensland was known for having many sharks and saltwater crocodiles. So once Michael was in the water, he was attacked by a shark or crocodile, or perhaps both. During this feeding frenzy, Michael's body was torn apart, his head was ripped off, and began to float away. At some point, one of the large tuna saw his head and ate it entirely. Later that day, Michael's colleagues caught the tuna that had eaten Michael's head. Thus, when the worker opened that tuna, he saw Michael's undigested head staring back at him, with his face appearing to be in terror, his eyes wide open, and his mouth open as if his last moment was a scream.